this lesson of the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, we learn about the importance of open files, as well as some basic pawn endgames, and of course, a beautiful jewel in chess. Well, let's start with the position we see on the board right now. It is Black's turn, and Black has a clear advantage, partly because their bishop on c6 is pressuring the pawn on g2, and therefore White's bishop on f1 has difficulty to develop. However, our theme for this lesson is the open files, and in addition to this first problem that White has, the main problem is actually that Black's rook managed to take control of the open files first. The first move is rook h to f8. White is not in the position to put one of his rooks on that file, obviously, because the bishop is still on f1. But White can try to take control of another open file, the e file. But Black has a second rook ready to occupy another open file. In fact, trying to get immediately to the second rank, which typically is a great accomplishment if a rook can get there and target the opponent's pawns on the second rank. White can try to prevent from the rook from getting to d2, but in this case, the Black other rook can go to f2, attacking the pawn on g2. And when White protects that pawn, then ready to come in with a second rook. And two rooks on the 7th or second rank, if it is from Black's perspective, is a very big accomplishment, and in this case, Black at least wins a pawn. Now I'd like to share with you one of my own games that I played a couple of years ago. I had the white pieces in this position, and there is only one open file. Let me clarify what is an open file. An open file is a file where neither side has a pawn. Even though there are plenty of pieces on that file, which is at the D file in this case, the pieces don't really count. Even though all these pieces are right there, they have the potential to move away at any time, unlike pawns which don't move to the side. So here, one of my tasks is to get control of that only open file, and therefore I moved my rook to d1. My opponent moved his knight to f8. It would be ideal for Black to try to put the knight to e6 and d4, which could be a nice outpost for Black's knight, just like the white knight is on d5. But as so often in chess, tactics can prevent strategical ideas. I have retreated my bishop to c2, which immediately creates a threat for Black. Namely, I'm threatening to capture the knight on f6. For example, if Black would continue with his plan, knight e6, White would trade on f6 with a check, and after queen captures, Black bishop on d6 is lost. Therefore, my opponent moved his bishop to c7. Now that the bishop left from d6, I made a very tricky move, and that is queen to c1. And this is something very typical, that rooks are ideal on open files, not so much queens. In this case, black's queen is in fact quite in a dangerous position because white is ready to make a discovery. For example, by knight capturing the pawn on b6. Even though it seems that the black bishop from c7 protects that pawn, in reality the white rook would attack black's queen after that move, so therefore black would at least lose a pawn. And here my opponent's best option was moving his knight to d7. But instead he moved his queen out of the way, allowing a trade on f6, which forces black to recapture and open up the g file in front of black's king. Now, in addition to white controlling the d file, white has a new target, the g file, and specifically, of course, black's king there. I continued by moving my knight to h4, partly to allow my rook to get to that half-open file and attack black's king. Of course, in addition, I'm also trying to put my knight to f5, getting closer to black's king. My opponent played knight to g6, and now, of course, not knight takes, when black would straighten his pawn structure by taking back with the f-pawn and also relatively defend his king. So therefore it's much better to move the knight to f5, keep black's pawn structure ruined, and of course the weakness of the g7 square. Now white has a very serious major threat, moving the queen up to h6 and then to checkmate. Therefore, my opponent tried to lock up that diagonal, close up my queen's route to h6, and in fact create a nasty threat. Very important, always look out not only for your own ideas and threats, but the ones of your opponent as well. And now black is threatening to fork with the knight on e2, my king and queen. I certainly would not like to see that. Therefore, I moved my king out of the way. And a typical thing that when a king is on an open file in potential danger, it's a good idea to move it to the corner and try to get a rook to the open file. Now I chased my opponent's knight away from f4, and the knight retreated to e6, and that means my queen is ready to come into the attack to h6, targeting black's pawn on f6. The only way black can defend the pawn is by the bishop. And now a nice little combination, removing the guard of that pawn. By rook takes bishop. The only way now black can protect the f6 pawn is by capturing with the queen, which my opponent did. And now a second rook comes to the open file, attacking black's queen. Now, if black would try to block up that threat with a knight, then white would be ready to checkmate with queen to g7. If black blocks with the bishop, then my plan was to sacrifice my second rook for another bishop, and after queen takes, removing the guard of the f6 pawn, I would capture that very pawn on f6, king g8, followed by bishop e5, and we can see how powerful the collaboration between the bishop and the queen is along those dark squares on the long diagonal, and black will get checkmated in the corner. Let's go back just a couple of moves. After rook d1, my opponent played the queen to c7, when again with a similar ending, queen captured on f6, check, king g8, bishop captured on e5, attacking black's queen, and when the queen moved away, the checkmate came in the corner. Let's look at some of the different situations about open files. The position we see on the board right now, there are a number of open files. The D and the E files are completely open. In fact, the D file is already occupied by white's rook. And then, of course, there are the half-open files, such as, for white, the C file, and from black's perspective, the B file. It's always important to understand what's important about a position. And in this case, black has two weaknesses, two isolated pawns, the one on a7 and the one on c6. Especially the one on the open file, that is on c6, is a target. And what white needs to do is try to pile up his pieces, especially rooks of course, against those targets. So the first correct move is rook to c1, forcing black to defend, and then simply double up our rooks. Rook c4. Black can also try to take control of an open file, but will remain on the defensive. Rook came d1 to c1, putting a second piece to pressure that pawn, and when black defends from the side, then the knight can come to d4 as a third attacker, in this case, in fact, with a tempo, attacking the rook as well. And black cannot avoid losing the pawn. Let's look at yet another situation when the open file can actually be used for a direct attack. Here, the only open file in the position is the H file. In situations when the two kings are being castled to opposite sides, that's an extremely important element, because it's much easier to attack when there are open files. In fact, oftentimes we are happy to sacrifice a pawn. For example, if white would have a pawn on h2 and black would have a pawn on h7, white often voluntarily gives up on that h pawn just to open the h file. In our case, those pawns are traded already, and the way white would take advantage of the fact that the file is open is by playing bishop h6. The general goal of white here is to get the queen helping the rook on the h file. So if white could get, for example, the queen on h4 or h3, that would be a real threat by moving the queen then to h7 to checkmate. In this case, because of the white pawns on f2 and g2, there is no quick and direct way to get the queen there, and therefore the best way to accomplish it, the quickest way, is to play bishop h6 with the idea to trade bishops, and after that bring the queen in to h6. Of course, if black would trade bishop h6, that would make things even worse, as after queen takes, the checkmate on h7 is unavoidable, even though black can make a space on f8, but in that case queen h8 would still checkmate. Also, it's important to notice the idea that after bishop h6, black cannot just easily move the bishop out of the way, because in that case the bishop would capture a rook and win an exchange. In this position, white has a passed pawn, and black's king seems to be quite far from it. However, the black king is still in the so-called square of the pawn. As you can see, there is a square relationship between the pawn and the king. So black would comfortably catch the pawn just on time, and each time the distance between the pawn and the king and the promotion square is like a square. The king catches the pawn just on time. Another way to calculate whether the king is catching that pawn on time or not is simply count the number of squares that the pawn would take to get promoted, which is 4 in this case, and the shortest number of moves that the king would take to get to that same square. So as you can see, the pawn's route is 4 squares and the king's route is also 4 squares. So therefore, the king arrives right on time. It's also important to note that the white king is not actively participating in supporting the white pawn. Therefore, the game is a draw. Let's see a more complex position about passed pawns and pawn promotion and if a king can catch the pawn. Well, the position we see here, white can try to be tricky and play c5 with the idea that if black captures, then white would not capture back, in which case black would win because would simply go and pick up white's pawns that are distant from the king of white's. But the idea would be to push through. White would not mind at all to give up on that c pawn, but get the b pawn promoted. As you can see, even visually, the black king is quite far from catching that pawn after king e5, b6, takes, b7. Black is just one move too late. The black king would need to be on c7 to be ready to capture white's promoted pawn. But in this case, the pawn promotes and white wins. But it's so important when you play chess not only to look for your good moves, but also of your opponents. And in this case, after c5, that good move for your opponent would be playing b5. And then white has no passed pawns, and yet the pawn on e5 is still weak and will be lost after black goes and attacks it. Let's go back to the starting position. And yet, white is able to win in this position. The question is, how? Well, here is the trick. White needs to play b5 first, preventing that option for black after white's pawn push. Then when the black king goes after white's e5 pawn, then comes c5. Now, if black captures, then the b pawn just runs away and is unstoppable. Or a little better answer is capturing the pawn with the idea that after pawn takes b6, king d6. But now black's problem is that black will run out of moves. Remember, if now the black king moves away anywhere, then the pawn gets to advance and black is not able to get to the crucial c7 square catching the pawn. So the only other thing black can do is move his f pawn, but then after king e3, black would lose the pawn and still end up needing to move the king away from the c7 square, and white's pawn would get promoted. And finally, I want to share with you another beautiful example of chess brilliancy. Look at this position. Kind of everything is hanging. There are back rank problems on both sides. It's true, white is up 2 pawns, but there are a lot of things going on. For example, it would be suicidal for white to capture black's queen, which would allow the black rook to come down to c1, followed by checkmate on the next move. It would be also wrong to capture black's rook on d7, because black could capture white's queen, as white is unable to recapture again because of the same problem with rook to c1 checkmate on the following move. So let's think for a moment, what can white do? Well, white is up 2 pawns, so how about simply taking care of this back rank problem, playing h3, so the white king can escape to h2 if needed when the check comes with the black rook on c1. Would this work? Well, not quite. Why not? Because black would trade queens and then pick up our rook, leaving black a rook ahead for the 2 pawns. So again, what should white do? Is white actually losing despite being 2 pawns up? Well, think carefully. White actually has a lovely move. Not enough that the queen is under attack, the rook is kind of under attack. White has a back rank problem. White's best move is putting his third major piece, the rook, also under attack. Quite amazing, isn't it? Now white is actually trying to give black the same medicine as he was just trying to use on white, the back rank problem. Now obviously white is trying to capture black's rook with a checkmate, which would be the move after black takes the queen and white checkmates. But black has some other options. For example, capturing white's rook on h7. Now it's one of those X-ray powers. The rook would capture on c8, and after queen captures to checkmate. Let's go back again. The move is rook to c2. So black could not capture the queen, black could not capture the rook on h7. How about capturing the rook on c2? Well, then black suffers from check on h8. And then the checkmate is unavoidable after a couple of blocking on the 8th rank. How about if black moves his queen to g8, trying to protect the rook on c8? Well then, the best solution is queen captures rook on d7, combining it with a new threat with queen takes b7. So after rook takes rook, which would threaten black, giving a checkmate on g2, but black is just one move too late. And of course, time in chess is extremely important. Almost checkmating or being one move too late is just not good enough, because white comes first by capturing on b7. And finally, what if after rook c2, what if the queen moves to e8, protecting both rooks in the meantime? Then, not rook takes, queen takes, and queen takes, because again, black would be the first one to give the checkmate. But after rook c2 and queen e8, the move is queen takes d7, threatening with the checkmate again. Queen takes, rook takes, leaving white a rook ahead because white's rook is safe because of black's back rank problem on d8. What a beautiful game, which was played, by the way, in 1878 between Schiffers and the famous Russian master Chigorin. Hope you enjoyed this beautiful example on the back rank checkmate, learning about open files and some interesting pawn endgames. Hope to see you back next week. So long until then.